So it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Mark Greene, who is an ex-New York ad man. That's an advertising man. Then the he's had the most fascinating CV. He was then the ex-vice principal of the London School of Theology. He's the son of a dentist. He's married to an anesthetic nurse, so he's well connected medically. And he served as the executive director of the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity for 21 years. So that's a think tank on applying Christian biblical views to the marketplace. He's now the full-time mission champion for LICC and a pioneer and champion for workplace ministry and whole life discipleship. And he's been devoted to empowering people to be fruitful for Christ in all of life and empowering church leaders and theological educators to help them to do it. Mark's a prolific writer. His books include Thank God It's Monday, Fruitfulness on the Front Line, The Great Divide, and The Whole of Life for Christ, a group Bible study. And for articles and films and resources by Mark, you can visit licc.uk, but we'll send you all those details after the talk. So Mark, it's a great privilege to have you on ICMDA webinars, and I believe you're going to start us off by reading some of Acts 27, and then into your talk. So look forward to hearing you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. I can't do all the languages, but I can do that one. And welcome to my home. I'm afraid I don't have any small children to come in and interrupt the seminar and look cute, but I do have a dog. But don't worry, he only barks at intruders and heretics. So we'll see how noisy an afternoon we get. Well, it's perhaps not surprising that after all the pressures that you've been through in the last year, that Peter was drawn to Paul's account in Acts 27, this account of his storm-tossed journey on his way to preach to Rome. As you may recall, Paul has appealed to Caesar, and he's finally on his way. He's developed a really good relationship with the centurion, Julius, who lets him go and see some friends when they reach Sidon. And then we pick up the account, which I'm going to read most of now, in verse 9 of chapter 27. So this is the living word of the living God. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous, because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbour was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. But when a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called the northeaster, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day the crew began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After they'd gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending that they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You have not eaten anything. Now, I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from their head. After he said this, he took some bread, gave thanks to God in front of them, then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they'd eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. Well, it is a rich, rich passage, and there are parallels we might explore between Paul and Jonah, 2 men in boats in a storm, both charged with communicating the good news about Jesus. And there are parallels we might explore between Paul in a boat in a storm and the disciples of Jesus in a boat in a storm. But for the time we have, I want to focus on what can we learn from how Paul responds under extreme pressure. What can we learn about the scope of our ministry in a crisis? And what can we learn about the scope of God's support for us in the storms we are facing? As you know, usually in Acts, we see Paul in short encounters with people in the marketplace or speaking on Mars Hill. But imagine for a moment that you are Paul in a boat with 273 people who don't know Jesus. Sailors, soldiers, other prisoners, no doubt, for months. Just you and Luke and Aristarchus. 3 out of 273, just 1% of the population. And I'm going to share some slides at this point, if that's all right with you. Just hopefully they will be helpful to you. So there's a slide. 3 out of 273. So you are a minority in a workplace, as many of you are, for a long, prolonged period of time, as many of you are. And in this case, you, Paul, build a good relationship with the centurion Julius, who gives you leave to see your friends. Then one day you are praying, and God gives you a vital message for the senior management team, that is the centurion, the pilot, and the owner of the boat. So you're a prisoner who's already been in 2 shipwrecks, and so you've got good reason to be nervous of sea travel. You're an itinerant teacher by trade, a maker of tents, and you find yourself convinced that the action that the professional sailors are proposing to take will lead to catastrophe. You're not a sea captain, but lives are at stake. So you speak up. And by doing so, you effectively challenge three types of power. You challenge the centurion, that is the power of the state. You challenge the pilot, that is the power of expertise, the senior consultant, if you like. And you challenge the owner, which is the power of money, the power of ownership. They ignore your advice, as often happens in all kinds of contexts. Wisdom from above is not always accepted, is it? We are not in control in our hospitals, our hospices, our surgeries. Others make decisions, and sometimes we can see that it's not going to turn out well. But in this instance, it is important to see that there is no easy solution. The boat is caught between, on the one hand, the increasingly dangerous weather in October, and the fact that the port that they are in is not safe to winter in. Paul's advice does not solve the problem of the danger to the ship. Yes, the people can disembark, the cargo can be unloaded, the tackle removed, but the owner may well still lose his ship or see it heavily damaged. Paul doesn't tell Julius that if they stay in the fair havens, all will be well. He simply says if they go, it won't. So it's risky either way. Now, I think it's important to see that he has been given, if you like, a prophecy. Now, in the Bible, we see various forms of prophecy, don't we? We see God sending people to speak to his own people. Samuel to Saul, Nathan to David, Elijah to Ahab. We see prophecy that relates to the great sweep of history, the fate of nations, or the coming of the Messiah. And in some streams of the contemporary church, prophecy is associated with particular people having particular words from God for people in church or in home groups, or indeed for colleagues of work. But at root, prophecy is simply speaking truth from God. And that truth may come to us in obviously supernatural ways, an angel, as here, a dream, as happens in many Muslim countries at the moment, may be impressed on us by God's supernatural spirit working through our reading of God's supernaturally inspired Bible. Now here the word comes to Paul in a clearly non-religious context. It's not in a small group or in a church, but out in the world. And it is first and foremost to be given to non-believers. And Paul makes his own view clear. But notice that Luke does not say that he uses any overtly religious language to do so. Now, at this stage, Julius and the soldiers and the crew would almost certainly know that Paul is a follower of the way, a follower of Jesus. After all, that is why he is under arrest. But I think Paul teaches us here that we don't always need to say, God says, or Jesus says. So God gives Paul wisdom from above, ultimately for the benefit of the whole crew. After all, God does not need a boat to get Paul to Rome. He can whistle up a whale from the Atlantic and dump him on an Italian beach at the mouth of the Tiber. But God is concerned for Paul's companions, and God offers information that will limit the commercial damage to the owner. Yes, you may lose your ship, but you will not lose the tackle, the cargo, and the people. Does God care about the physical and material well-being of the people that you serve? Does he care about their economic flourishing? Well, yes, he does, and it has always been so. And we see this concern for our physical environment, our physical and emotional and mental well-being from Eden onwards, if you like. There in Eden, God creates a wonderful context for human beings to flourish in. There is delicious, nutritious food, there is running water, there is a gorgeous environment, there's a plethora of wildlife to enjoy, there is purposeful work to be done, and there is fellowship with God. Yes, humankind rebel, but God's desire to bless persists. And in Genesis 12, God promises that through Abraham, all nations will be blessed. And blessing is never simply understood in spiritual terms. It encompasses every aspect of human life: food, family, friends, finance. We see it in Jeremiah, don't we? In Jeremiah, God commands his people to what? To seek peace and prosperity of the city to which he has carried them into exile, to pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, they too will prosper. Notice he says not only to pray for the peace and prosperity, the shalom in the Hebrew, of the city, but to seek it. There is something to be done. And what is shalom? It is wholeness, isn't it? It's fulfillment. It's, yes, the spiritual welfare of the city, but also the political, the physical, the mental, the emotional, the relational, the ecological, and the economic welfare of the city, of the town, of the hospital, of the hospice, of the practice, of the ward, of the ambulance, of the pharmacy that you're in. But let's go back to Paul. Paul's job is to speak up for the welfare of others, but he does not win the argument, does he? And our job often is also to speak truth for the benefit of others, but we may not win the argument. We may believe that the policy is wrong, the protocol misguided, the praxis dangerous, but it may not change. Not many of us are actually in charge, but speaking out may still be the right thing to do and important for the longer term, as it is here. And so you set sail and you're Paul and you know that this boat is going down. What is the scope of your ministry now that you have been ignored? What is the scope of your ministry now that you know that the boat is going down and you and everyone else with it, you can see the storm coming? I wonder what many of you prayed back in early March 2020, when I'm sure many of you could see the storm coming, the pandemic coming. And this storm comes, and in Paul's case, it rages for days. And the crew do what professionals know to do. They follow best practice. They throw the cargo overboard, but it's not enough. And everyone despairs for life. And what do you do when you know that this business, this hospital, this is going to collapse? Do you, if you're Paul and you're going down in the boat, do you just pray to God, send me a whale like you sent Jonah a whale? Pick me up and take me to Italy and bring Luke and Aristarchus too. How does Paul respond? In the middle of this terrible storm, with the boat heaving and the waves crashing and the wind blowing and the sun blotted out from the sky and your body being lurched from side to side and your stomach in your cranium, do you have any space left in your heart for anyone else? But Paul prays for everyone's mortal lives, not just their eternal lives. He prays holistically. He encourages them emotionally by telling them that not one of them is going to die. Here's what he says. Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. That's verses 21, 22. Now, he does not remind them that they ignored his advice before to make them feel guilty, but rather to strengthen their confidence in what he is now saying. I was right before, so you can trust me now. And then Paul, if you like, witnesses to them very clearly, encouraging them emotionally and witnessing clearly. He tells them this, doesn't he? Last night, an angel of the Lord, of the God to whom I belong, what beautiful words, and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. Now notice that the angel tells Paul that God has given him the lives of all who sail with you. So it's obvious that Paul has been praying for the people on his front line, in his context, in the boat that he's in, for their physical rescue, as well as no doubt for their eternal salvation. He is not like Jonah, who doesn't bother to pray for the sailors in his boat. He's not in a team in the ICU with a panicked, angry manager just praying to get through the next 12 hours themselves. He's praying for everyone. He's doing what he can. He's not a doctor in, say, an Edinburgh GP, general practitioner's practice, content with his salary, but indifferent to the fact that the administrative people haven't had a salary rise for 5 years. Well, let me tell you a story about Vicky, who is a respiratory physio in London, who was deployed to the ICU, which was overflowing with patients. And one day she's standing there in full protective clothing, holding a young patient's hand, and the oxygen blowers are on full blast, and she is silently praying that God would heal him and that he would save his soul. It's not the first time that she would do that, and it wouldn't be the last. And not everyone got better. And sometimes in the UK hospital system, you just don't know. People get moved. But anyway, a few weeks later, a friend of hers asked her if she had treated this man. And Vicky said, well, I'm not at liberty to disclose that information. It's confidential. Well, her friend said, he got better and he became a Christian. Well, if you take Vicky out of the ICU, maybe that young man dies apart from Christ. Take Paul and his companions off the boat, and maybe 273 people die. Take my friend, doctor friend Richard, out of that Edinburgh general practitioner's practice, and the administrative people probably would not have got a raise in their salary. Take you out of your context, and almost certainly things are not going to be the same. There's a story in the UK of an accident emergency manager. Lou Adams was her name, and one day she comes into her shift and the ambulance forecourt is full of ambulances. Patients are coming out, and she goes into the accident and emergency area, and it's overflowing with patients, absolutely overflowing with patients. And the team was completely overwhelmed. And she went back outside onto the forecourt, and she just prayed very quickly to God, Lord, help us, give us a reprieve, just help us, please. And then she went back into a leaders' meeting upstairs. 5 minutes later, she came downstairs, and the forecourt, there were no ambulances there, and not a single ambulance came in for 2 hours. For 2 hours. And nobody could believe it around her. People who were not Christians calling it a miracle. How could that be? Take her out of that story, and maybe that team doesn't get a reprieve. We are entrusted by God with the contexts we find ourselves in. Like Paul, we don't always choose our circumstances, and he was exactly where he was meant to be. We don't choose our circumstances, but maybe we can choose whether we consciously, intentionally involve God there. We seek the shalom of the contexts that he's put us in, the shalom of the surgery or the ward. We are, if you like, stewards of the contexts we're in, stewards of the opportunities that God gives us, stewards of the people that God puts amongst. So Paul brings encouragement, doesn't he? God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. But again, interestingly, he does not at this point name Jesus. He doesn't name the particular God he serves. But he does make it clear that this is the God who is guaranteeing his safety and the passengers and the crew. So what is Paul doing here? He's simply bearing witness of God's action in his life and what he has experienced about Jesus. Does he lay out the whole gospel in all its fullness at this point? Apparently not. But might people be interested? Might they wonder if this God is real? Might they come to Paul and ask him about it then? Or might they wait to see if they survive, to see if this God's promise is true? Well, we don't know. He's bearing witness, sharing what the good news means to him on that day. How did you put up with that bad-tempered boss? How did you get that job done on time? Sometimes people see things in us we don't. Vicky, the respiratory physio that I mentioned earlier, had been doing 12-hour shifts for weeks, not getting a break, as many as you haven't had, not getting much to eat or drink, swathed in PPE, the noise of the machine so loud that you had to shout to communicate, with more than twice as many patients than the ICU had ever had before, all of them needing close attention. You know all about it, and no doubt some of you much worse. Relentless, exhausting. And at team meetings, she'd tell people how hard she'd been finding it. And then one day a colleague said to her, "Oh, Vicky, you're so inspiring." Vicky just couldn't believe it. And she said to her, I've been in tears pretty much every day. But she had been inspiring. It's not just about putting on a brave face, but there was something about her. And Vicky told me that every day before going into her 12-hour shift, she'd simply prayed, "Lord, give me what I need for this." And every day she'd listen to a particular worship song before going to work. Yet not I, but through Christ in me. Christ lives in us and shines through our weakness and through distress. God had done something in her that made others see her as an inspiration. Reality is, isn't it, that often the more we involve God, the richer our testimony becomes. So Paul had encouraged emotionally, he had, if you like, witnessed clearly, and he had strengthened them physically. He says to them, take some food. Take some food. We care for people's physical well-being, don't we? Of course you know that. But in lots of more normal situations, that may not be obvious. But perhaps, particularly for colleagues, to notice that they've not been able to get away from reception for hours, or that they've not had a cup of tea or coffee since yesterday. So Paul is caring for the heart, the mind, the body, and the spirit. And then we see him do something which, certainly to me, in my UK context, seems odd. He prays in public. He says grace in public. Now, a couple of years ago, my wife, who's an anaesthetist nurse, was working in theatre in a National Health Service hospital. And on the Sunday before, she'd got a sense from God that something bad was going to happen the following day. So she told me about it, and we prayed about it, so that she was ready. And she went into work the following day, and about 40 minutes into her shift. The whole theatre team that weren't actually in theatre and all the staff on that particular team were called into the staff room, and they were told that one of their colleagues, a theatre nurse's 6-year-old son, had fallen out of a window and had died. And the person who delivered the news said something like, "And do pray for her," which is unusual in the UK, and bless her for doing it. And my wife at that point just said, "Well, let's do it now." And right there and then she prayed in an NHS staff room with a mixture of Christians and people of other faiths and probably agnostics and atheists. At that moment, she took a stand to say that in this unimaginable pain, in this terrible situation, there is a God who cares, and we can share this pain with him. In this situation, when all the skills of our brilliant doctors have done what they can, and it was not enough, there's a place to go. No one came up to her afterwards and complained. What Paul is here is, what he's doing here is, it's not just giving thanks for the food, is it? He's modeling something. He's modeling his faith in God's rescue. When he holds up the food and eats himself, he's saying, I am calm enough to eat. And I believe it's worth eating because I'm not going to die. So I am going to need my strength. Eating is a sign of trust with God. So when the others eat, when he persuades them to eat, they're doing something that at some level is a step of faith. I trust enough in Paul's words, at least, to eat, to think it's worth eating because I'm not going to die. He invites them to live in line with their faith. But there's something perhaps you picked up as you heard the words read in the words he uses. Notice he took some bread and gave thanks for it. Well, those words are very, very similar, aren't they, to the words that Jesus says on the Emmaus Road. He took bread, gave thanks, and broke it. What is Paul doing? It's the same words that he's using at the Last Supper, and it's Luke every time. Paul is feeding on Christ here. How do we get through? We feed on Christ. So we see Paul's ministry, interceding holistically, encouraging emotionally, witnessing clearly, strengthening physically, and then protecting practically. When the crew try to leave, Paul tells the centurion they must not leave, and this time the centurion listens. So Paul is under enormous stress, isn't he? Life-threatening pressure. But even under immense personal pressure, he does not lose sight of the mission he's been called to. I wonder whether we have such a big, multi-dimensional vision for the missional impact that we can make in the boats that we're in, and indeed more broadly, the boats that our families and our fellow believers are in, whatever the pressure, in good times as well as in hard times. In the UK, if you like, in all these kinds of places where people find themselves. Does the student in the university, the mother at the school gate, the worker in the coffee shop, the labourer at the port, the executive in an office have such a rich vision, seeking the best for the people they meet and the organizations they're involved with, offering wisdom from above, praying for physical protection, witnessing clearly, taking prayerful, practical initiatives for the well-being of those around them? Is this the kind of vision we're encouraging one another with? Well, Paul was in a boat with a lot of people, 275 other people. What boat are you in, and who is with you? What's on their minds and hearts? What's God doing there, and what does he want you to do? And of course, Acts reminds us that we don't go alone. It just doesn't give us a picture of the scope of our ministry. It shows us the faithfulness of the God who sends us. This is the God who sends with purpose, who grants favor with non-believers, who gives wisdom from above, wisdom beyond human analysis, who communicates whatever the barriers. He sends an angel who responds in prayer making clear what he will do, who strengthens his people by word and presence, who keeps his promise, not one person is lost, and who fulfills his purposes, for the gospel will be heard in Rome. This is our God, the God of Paul and Lydia, Mary and Martha, Lou and Vicky, and by great grace, the God of you and me, Emmanuel. What needs changing where you are? Whose salvation might you specifically pray for? What do you need help with right now? Let me pray. Lord, on our front line, on your front line, on my front line, with the support of my brothers and sisters in Christ, help me to model godly character, to make good work, to minister grace and love, to mold the culture around me, to be a mouthpiece for truth and justice, and a messenger of the gospel, for the shalom of the towns that we serve, for the healing of our nations, and for the salvation of many. To the praise of your mighty name, Lord, and for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. We've been listening to Dr. Mark Greene speaking on sharing life under pressure, lessons from the life of Paul in Acts 27. And what a wonderful image to take at this time of a journey through a storm and a shipwreck where everything's beyond our control, to draw all these important lessons about what God can do with us in this desperate time, particularly of COVID, but with the pressures that we face every day, being believers in a world that's hostile or often ignorant of Christian faith and values. So we're going to move into a time of question and answer now. Mark, first of all, we've got a question from someone you may well know, Howard Lyons, who's a member of the ICMDA board, and Howard says healthcare professionals have become more prominent in society through the pandemic. Of course they have, but in what ways do you think Christian healthcare professionals can make use of this prominence to further God's mission of putting love where love is not?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Howard, for that question. I think you're in a very good position to answer it yourself. Perhaps you will. It's a good question, isn't it? Because it very much partly depends on in which context you find yourself. I think one of the things in my context in the UK is that lots of people are very grateful in a way that they weren't before. We may say thank you, but we now understand what some people have been through, what they go through in order to serve us. And I think that has changed the relationship. And even in the church, I mean, many medics, even in the UK, don't feel particularly encouraged within their local churches, even though they may be the most likely people to be prayed for, because I think sometimes people don't know what they go through. And it's hard to feel really appreciated if you don't know, if you feel that people don't know what's going on. And now people do. And I suppose the opportunity is that, particularly with non-believers who say, well, thank you so much, doctor, or, so appreciate all your work that you've been doing, and how are you? And, nurses who are in the ICU and all kinds of people who've been redeployed, people know this. I think it's an opportunity to say, first of all, to receive thanks, thank you very much, but also to give some testimony about how they've been helped. So, for example, it must have been really, really difficult. Somebody might say to you, we so appreciate your work. Yeah, it has been very difficult. But, I've been so helped by the prayers of my local church, or I've sensed God there with me. Those aren't challenging things. They're just testimonial things. And I think the other thing that has, if you like, those are interpersonal things. I think the other thing that's become clear, and this would be perhaps even more marked in some of the countries that some of the countries represented here, is the inequality that exists even in an affluent first world nation like the UK between various areas and sectors of society. And so I do think this is an opportunity for health professionals as a sector to be saying some things to government and as a body about that inequality and how so many people in some areas are suffering much worse because much less money comes their way. So I think there are interpersonal things and, if you like, issues of justice.
Thanks very much. And that's a huge issue for us as an international association of Christian doctors and dentists, because some of us in this COVID pandemic are we're all in the same storm, but we're in very different boats. And particularly our brothers and sisters in Latin America and in India at the moment are suffering with a huge new wave of cases and very low vaccination rates. And we do have a real responsibility in countries which are getting over it to help them. Claudia Stein is asking, Mark, what would you advise people who are in a Paul in the storm situation, isolated believers in their organizations, if you like, and who pray and minister to people in the storm, but receive nothing but persecution and hostile opposition from those they're trying to rescue? And it's quite interesting that the story you've described, of course, of Paul, he was ignored, certainly initially at least, but he got a reasonably good reception in the boat, although we know he didn't everywhere he went. But so a word for those who are perhaps in a more hostile situation at the moment. What do they do?
Yes, and you're quite right. I mean, Paul also has Luke and Aristarchus with him. So he's not, in a sense, the only follower of Jesus in that boat. Well, I hesitate to comment on this with a group of people like this on the call. I think that the reality is when we look at people like Isaiah, who no one listens to, and we look at Jeremiah, and indeed when we read many of the Psalms of David, who went through 10, 20 years of rejection, and when you read those Psalms, you realize how deeply he felt it, the betrayal of friends and the isolation that he felt as a man, even though he was anointed. I think we have resources in God's word to help us see how his people have dealt with that over the years. So that would be the first thing, if you like, to be looking to those passages, and indeed to the Lord himself, who, is calling on the Lord for support and for the strengthening, and is anointed with the strengthening of the Spirit to go through tremendous rejection and pain for the sake of others. I think that would be, the sense of, you may not be doing anything wrong at all. You may be doing absolutely everything right, but the hostility will still come. And, my sense is that the Lord will honor that. He honors that in his people. He honors the blood of the martyrs. He honors the stand and the readiness of his people to suffer for his sake. But the other thing I think is that, and this may not apply to the person asking the question, is that very, very often in my context in the UK, Christians who are going through it they don't have some people who are standing with them and praying for them through it. They're not supported by the community. And I think that is the absolutely critical thing that gets many people through this. That is to have one or two people in your life who want to know and who you can tell what is going on.
Thank you. And support groups, I guess that brings us on to, and you pointed out, of course, that Paul wasn't alone. There were 273 people, but he had with him Luke and Aristarchus. So they had their small group, didn't they? And they're right in the first century. Could you say enlarge a little bit more on the importance of support groups, people that we can really tell everything to, who especially uphold us in prayer in these kind of situations? There's a question from Liette Pilon there.
Well, they don't have to be very big. The first thing. you know, it can be two people, it can be one person, but it can be the one person who prays for you. I mean, I have, when my son was very, very ill, there was one man who still does pray for him every day. Actually, he's been praying for him for 7 years every day. And I know that, and it's incredibly encouraging. And when, as a family, we were suffering really quite badly, you know, you just know somebody's praying for you every day. And I could send him a text, day or night, didn't matter, you know, and I knew that. So there was a mechanism also of what you might call instant communication that didn't need long explanation because he already knew the overall situation. Please pray, crisis, please pray this, please pray that, please pray, and you could rely on it. And so I think there is both the opportunity regularly, even if infrequently, to be with one or two people and say, this is what's going on. And then the ongoing knowledge that they're going to pray for you every week. And if you've got a crisis, you can send a text or something. I had a friend who was in business actually, and I actually met with him probably 3 times a month. But he was a very senior man, and I didn't really understand his context. You know, I didn't really get it. I mean, it was, you know, particularly as it grew and grew and grew, I just didn't really get it. And it's always helpful to have somebody. And once every 3 months, he would get together with a group of 3 other men who happened to be men, and for 1 hour, just for 1 hour, and in one of those offices, and they were all at the same kind of level, and they really got each other's world. They really understood what it's like, and they would share for about 7 minutes each, half an hour between the 4 of them, and then they would pray for half an hour, once a quarter. And he absolutely loved that. And I couldn't give him that. So it's great to have people, if you like, who are sort of prepared to pray as I am, but somebody who knows what it's like to be a theatre nurse, or knows what it's like to be a midwife, or knows what it's like to be a consultant, or knows what it's like, whatever. It's great to have somebody like that.
That's great. I remember you, Mark, a few years ago at the Lausanne conference, giving 2 tips that would turn a church upside down. And one of them was to have a slot on the Sunday where any member of the church gave a short talk about this time tomorrow, what they were doing this time tomorrow, and how they could be prayed for. And then the other thing you said was for the pastor to go along and visit people in their workplace, a different person every week, and that would turn the church upside down. And as you say, it's all about understanding each other's context, isn't it? Because we may not be in the same situation ourselves, but we can at least go some way to understanding it and praying more meaningfully. There's a question here from Hedwin Kadrianto, who is one of our field workers actually in Indonesia and Java. And he's saying, do you have any practical suggestions for national Christian medical associations, national CMFs, on how we can give care to the many frontliners who are serving under pressure, often long hours, not able to get to church, missing regular fellowship, and so on. You've covered this in a way already, but anything more, not so much at the individual level, but at the national association level?
Well, I mean, I imagine there's quite a number of ideas. I think CMF themselves now are beginning to work on what you might call area groups or regional groups, deliberately trying to connect people who are within a certain kind of geography so that they can get to know each other and help one another that way, rather than just having one big list. And I think that's a really good idea. Often people are curiously disconnected. Sometimes quite amazing that people discover they've been working in the same hospital as somebody they've been going to church with for 20 years and didn't know. I think that notion, if you're a national group, you could probably do that. You could probably find out where people actually work or where they actually live, and then begin to connect them with the technology. I'd love to see that happen for people. Howard Lyons is telling us they're called catalyst groups. He asks the questions and he answers them. Fantastic.
Well, we've got lots.
I told you, Howard, you would answer the question.
we've got lots of good suggestions here. Sherry Falkenheimer from the US is saying people from the CMF who can meet over a meal or coffee personally and briefly to listen, encourage and pray for them. Also saying that the CMDA chapter in the US and New York City started an online time called Oasis to have time to worship, pray and share together. I know we have a local group here in Hertfordshire in the UK which does that and has been hugely important for us, just meeting for prayer at 8 p.m. on a Thursday every second week, and we've kept it going for the last 14 months. It's been wonderful. Timothy Hardcastle from South Africa is mentioning WhatsApp groups and mentor groups to try and do it, and Sherry's come back again with another suggestion of soliciting prayer requests periodically from CMF members. In ICMDA, we have a prayer diary which comes out every 2 months and goes right around our 14 regions. It's translated into 6 or 7 different languages. And it's been amazing how that has built our sense of togetherness and fellowship and strengthening and stirring up one another to love and good works over the last 14 weeks or so, even much more than I think would have been possible had we been free to travel. There's been more international linkages set up. Mark, we're just about out of time, but I wanted just at the end, just to give you your best known, I think, in the UK for when you have this book, Thank God It's Monday, and you've brought a wonderfully refreshing view of God's concern for the workplace and every part of our lives, which has come out very strongly in your talk today as well. But just to say a few words to us perhaps about, just to enlarge on that, God's concern for the whole person, not just the things we do within the 4 walls at church, but where we spend 90% of our lives, and his holistic concern for all of us. So just a final word from you on that, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, thank you. Recently, I've been thinking about this in terms of what kind of father do we think God is? And is God the kind of father who, for example, has a daughter and the daughter is 16 years old and all the father is actually interested in is how she is doing in maths, physics, chemistry and biology, because he wants her, the father wants her to be a doctor and she needs to do very well in those subjects. And all he's interested in is that. He's not actually interested in the fact that she's very good at tennis, or that she loves to dance, or that she loves donuts, or that her best friend's name is Anita and they love to go walk in the park, or anything like that. Not really interested in any of the things. She can talk about it, but not really interested in any of that. Not interested in her humanity, her enthusiasms, her joys, but just interested in that. That's what's the thing that really counts about this person. And I don't think God is like that. I think God is a father who's interested in every aspect of our being, and that obviously includes our work, but it also might include your hobby, or the ability to go do something else, to enjoy, a great meal, the best borscht in Russia, whatever it might be. And for me, that's where it comes from. So what we see in God the Father is a God who is interested in all of us, because he's made every bit of us, but he's also interested in. He's also given us something to do, to use our skills in that way, because when he made the world, he made it perfect, but not completed. He made it not yet mature. So he's actually really interested in how we use our skills and our aptitudes to bring out the best in his world, to heal it, restore it, expand possibilities. And I know many of you do many of those things every day. Yeah, and shalom to you all in all of it.
Mark, thank you so much. We've been listening to Dr. Mark Greene, who was for many years Executive Director of the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, 21 years, and is now their full-time mission champion and a real champion for God in the workplace and the holistic Christian life. So God bless you all. From me, Dr. Peter Saunders, CEO of ICMDA, and from all of the team here, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week. God bless you.